The following program is brought to you by democracyatwork.info. Broadcasting from a U.S. colony, my name is Andrew Mercado-Vázquez, and this is Puerto Rico Forward, a program that takes a look at the economics and legal structures at play between the United States of North America and Puerto Rico. Now, before we move on to the content of today's episode, being a pilot episode, I'd like to provide a short 5-item list on what are the main objectives of this program. Let's just get straight to it because we have a lot to discuss. Now, first off, the first objective is to provide a critical view of prevailing economic policies. Economic policies are an important part of Puerto Rico because if it weren't for certain economic interests that push certain economic policies, Puerto Rico would probably not be a colony. After all, that's the whole purpose of a colony. It's to exploit it economically. The second objective is to raise awareness of Puerto Rico's undemocratic political status. Now, this one basically ties into the first point, but more importantly, it's a focus on the legal mechanisms that allow such an undemocratic, unfair form of status to actually exist. Some people call Puerto Rico a commonwealth, some call it a territory, others call it a possession, and others that are more intellectually honest call it what it is. It's a colony. Third point is to share a historical background of Puerto Rico and its relationship with the United States of North America. If we acknowledge that Puerto Rico has a problem, you need to understand the roots of that problem. If you do not, what you're trying to do is basically futile, because you're not going to understand why it is that Puerto Rico is what it is, an economically exploited territory. And you can only do that by looking at the past, looking at the facts, and understanding what moved those in power to treat Puerto Rico the way it's treated. Now, the fourth objective is to review current events that have a legal or economic impact on Puerto Rico. And finally, the most important objective of this program is to help force the Puerto Rico issue into political agendas. We need to make it so that no politician, no person running for any type of position in government is able to avoid expressing themselves on the Puerto Rico issue. Why is that important? Because if we don't talk about it, we don't know it exists. And if we don't know it exists, certain interests use that in order to advance their own personal interests. And in the case of Puerto Rico, that can actually be deadly. So we need to make politicians, people in government, civil servants, grassroots organizations, everybody needs to take a position, a stance on the Puerto Rico issue. Because if we don't push this issue and it stays in the shadows, it's not going to be resolved. So, with that in mind, let's get right to it. Now, first off, Puerto Rico is not an island. It's actually an archipelago composed of about 140 insular geostructures, including islands, islets, and keys. The main island is the largest one and measures about 100 by 35 miles, and that's the one that carries the name Puerto Rico. Inhabited by South American Arawak natives, later called Taino Indians, Puerto Rico, or Boriqueñ as they called it, had been supporting a developing civilization for almost 1,000 years prior to Columbus's landing on November 19th, 1493. However, it wasn't until August 12th, 1508, that Juan Ponce de León, another famous conquistador of the time, credited with discovering Florida, arrived along with 50 people to colonize Puerto Rico. Now, that date is actually very important, August 12th, 1508. From that day, right to this moment, Puerto Rico would never again retain its sovereignty. From that moment onward, Puerto Rico would always belong to an imperial superpower. That's actually half a millennia of colonialism between Spain and the United States of North America, each period having distinct economic traits. Regarding the Spanish period, the first economic attraction that the Spanish crown felt towards Puerto Rico was that of a lust for gold. But this fling was actually short-lived. By the mid-1530s, gold deposits were depleted, leaving the Spanish government scratching its head as to what to do with its newly claimed territory. The answer came in the form of Puerto Rico's strategic location. You see, by this time, Spain had various colonial interests in what is known today as Mexico and all of Central and South America. Spain's dominion over Cuba and Puerto Rico gave it an important commercial edge over its European counterparts by controlling the sea lanes to and from the New World. Such was the importance of Puerto Rico in the economic success of European interests that from 1528 to the end of the century, France attacked Puerto Rico in the hopes of overtaking the island. As a result, in 1539, Spain began construction of El Morro, an imposing fortress overlooking the San Juan harbor that still stands to this day. So the next time you come by and you see the famous tourist attraction, you can thank French persistence and Spanish paranoia for it. Now, of course, soldiers were not the only people living in the archipelago. You see, a small agricultural economy actually started to develop by the 16th century, and it was fueled by the introduction of various plants and animals brought by Spain. However, Spain's policy was never to turn its colonial possessions into production-type economies, mostly consisting of small-scale, self-sufficient type agriculture. What little cash crop-like activity was due in part to the colonial government's promotion of tobacco and sugar production, but it paled in comparison to the stimulation of trade through contraband. In essence, the first 250 years of Spain's rule were characterized by neglect and economic backwardness. Puerto Rico's main purpose was to serve as a military stronghold. The needs of the people fell basically to a secondary plane. It wasn't until the mid-18th century, after a special envoy of the Spanish crown inspected the archipelago and reported its deeply impoverished state, that means were taken to improve economic growth. Such efforts led to an increase in population and also an increase in sugar production and exportation. As a result, sugar became the most important cash crop and benefited from a more relaxed trade policy, allowing local producers and merchants to seek customers beyond Spain and increasing economic activity. However, just as it is today, the benefits of this improved economic climate were not perceived by the general population. Once again, the few enjoyed the benefits, while the many feasted on the crumbs. Spain itself was suffering a wide array of economic and social turmoil. By the time the 19th century came along, the nations of Europe were up to their necks in war and revolution, and Spain was particularly vulnerable due to its economic backwardness. It lacked a bourgeois capitalist revolution, such as those that took place in England, France, and Germany, that would create the climate for the emergence of a political base for the industrial revolutions. For Spain, the writing was on the wall considering its predominantly feudal economic order and state monopoly of trade. Neighboring nations quickly took notice of Spain's weakened state and began moving in for the kill. England and France, attracted by the resources, labor, internal markets, and strategic locations of its colonies, forced Spain into costly wars. Such conflicts proved too big a strain on its budget, provoking a loosening of Spain's grip on Puerto Rico. And so, as the sun was setting on Spain's imperial legacy, a new player was actually emerging in the international stage. A new superpower and Puerto Rico's present colonial master, the great United States of North America. Now, actually, this might be a little surprising for most people, but from its early stages, the United States showed signs of having an interest for extending its power beyond its territorial limits. Even before its independence, prominent figures in its patriotic pantheon were cultivating imperial tendencies. Benjamin Franklin himself manifested such imperial tendencies when in 1761 he suggested that Britain attack Mexico and Cuba in order to transform them into British colonies and that way secure an English-speaking North America. Of course, it didn't take long after its independence for some of the founding fathers to catch the expansionary bug. Now, although it's ironic to the point of vulgarity, the United States had developed the same taste for colonial conquest as its former master, Great Britain. In any case, putting aside the hypocrisy that is a former colony seeking to have its own colonial possessions, the economic and strategic implications of controlling the pathway between the New World and Europe were too attractive for the U.S. to ignore. Many attempts were made to secure U.S. interests in the Caribbean region. In 1854, Franklin Pierce's administration wrote the Ostend Manifesto, which called for the annexation of Cuba and Puerto Rico. Now, besides its important strategic location for military purposes, the U.S.'s raving economy provided a proper excuse for expansionary policy. You see, by the end of the 19th century, a certain concern would start to emerge arising from the fear that one day the ideal of infinite growth would be impaired as U.S. businesses ran out of land, saturated their markets, and would have no place to invest their excess capital. Two solutions were offered to remedy this conundrum: the acquirement of foreign territories or establishing trade. Although trade was the most convenient solution, seeking and obligating new markets through colonial conquest provided the most security for U.S. interests. Trade was only possible as far as the local government's administrative capabilities would allow. Faced with Spain's languishing powers over the colonial territories with which the United States had established trade relations, U.S. capitalist interests pushed for the annexation, a common euphemism of the day, of Cuba and Puerto Rico. Their fear was that, if not them, another European superpower would take over Spain's colonies, placing in jeopardy U.S. capitalist interests. Alfred T. Mahan, one of the U.S.'s most influential military theorists of the time, would repeatedly advocate for the annexation of Puerto Rico as a central requirement for the advancement of the U.S.'s economic and military interests. Although public opinion in the U.S. was divided between isolationists, who opposed annexation, and annexationists, who favored it, by 1898, Cuba's revolutionary violence placed the issue center stage in U.S. foreign policy. At the moment, the U.S. had more than $33 million invested in Cuba. Now, I invite anybody listening to this podcast to please calculate how much money that would represent nowadays. We're talking about $33 million in 1898. Cuba's political instability was perceived to be one of the biggest obstacles to U.S. economic growth. On February 15, 1898, a U.S. battleship called the USS Maine was destroyed in the Havana harbor by a mysterious explosion. Today, that explosion is actually attributed to a possible faulty boiler. However, the incident was used to sway public opinion in favor of U.S. military intervention, and the press helped by attributing the explosion to a Spanish bomb. In April of that same year, President McKinley would send his war message to Congress, and by April 21st, Spain broke diplomatic relations with the U.S., thus marking the beginning of the Spanish-American War. The fighting began on May 1st, 1898, but only lasted 115 days. Secretary of State John Hayes would later call it his splendid little war. Finally, on July 25, 1898, the U.S. Expeditionary Forces landed on the western coast of Puerto Rico under the command of Nelson A. Miles. 3 days later, General Miles would issue a proclamation stating that he was conquering Puerto Rico for its own good, and that his forces came in the name of, and I quote, liberty, justice, and humanity, end of quote. Also speaking to the people of Puerto Rico, he said that he was compelled, and I quote again, by the noble proposition of searching out the enemies of our country and yours, end of quote. But for all its glory and self-righteousness, said generosity did not include the right to self-government or self-determination. By the end of the year, on December 10th, the U.S. and Spain signed the Treaty of Paris, in which Spain would agree to cede Guam and Puerto Rico. The United States of North America, an advocate of John Locke's philosophy of individual rights and democratic form of self-government, now had colonies of its own. And so began a tense and toxic relationship between the United States of America and Puerto Rico. So that's basically a general economic overview of Puerto Rico's history. And there's a lot that we need to talk about in order to understand why Puerto Rico is what it is nowadays. Even though it's in the past, Puerto Rico's relationship with the United States of America and Puerto Rico's relationship with Spain have left deep scars in its social fabric. This program is for the people that want to know more about Puerto Rico. And in a larger spectrum, even if you don't care about Puerto Rico as a subject per se, you will find in Puerto Rico's relationship with the United States and North America a reflection of what happens when an economic machine eats away at a society in order to feed the hunger for profit. Puerto Rico has been a U.S. territory, which is basically a euphemism for colony, for over 100 years. And a lot of the supposed progress for the United States has been at the cost of the people of Puerto Rico. Now, in a day and age where there's a lot of very honest, very worthy causes to fight for, as a result of a lot of nasty, egregious injustices happening on a monthly basis, it seems nowadays, Puerto Rico has to occupy a very high position in that list because it's been oppressed, it's been exploited, and it has suffered the worst end of colonialism for over 100 years. And it's been receiving such treatment under the flag of a nation whose anthem says it's the land of the free. Puerto Rico is the most solid example of the failure of a system that doesn't care about anything else than increasing share value. Puerto Rico is an issue that cannot be ignored anymore by anybody. Doesn't matter where you are in the political spectrum. And the populace of the United States of North America need to put Puerto Rico as an issue in everybody's agenda. The action has to come from the people living in the United States of North America that have that political power and can actually push this subject. And with that, I'm going to bring to a close this episode of the Puerto Rico Report, not without first recommending some reading for those of you that are interested. There's a book called Economic History of Puerto Rico, Institutional Change and Capitalist Development. The author is James L. Dietz. That's D-I-E-T-Z. Dietz. Great book. If you find it, read it, learn. That's going to be it for today, guys. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your time. Y que viva Puerto Rico.